Well, good morning once again, Life Church. Good to see you guys out there. We really miss seeing you. Really miss being together personally, face to face. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the service, things are a little crazy in our world today, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we work through part 2 of our teaching series here today, which is Adventure with Jesus. So we're talking about adventure with Jesus, finding faith, freedom, and following Jesus into the great unknown. That's a bit of where we find ourselves today, even in light of everything that's going on with the crises that we're facing as a country, as a nation, and also just what it means to be followers of Jesus in an ever-changing world, an ever-changing time. And so one of the questions that we're kind of wrestling with here in this series was Christianity something that was started by Jesus, born out of the Jewish faith, and Jesus came and innovated and changed and taught new things and kind of changed the whole structure of how we understand God and how we should connect with God. And did Jesus give us sort of a new way, but it was a static new way? It was sort of set in stone. We went from one group of things that were set in stone to another way that is set in stone. Or did Jesus give us something that was a bit more dynamic, a bit more that gave us freedom to innovate and gave us freedom to be able to take this faith, this teaching, this message of Jesus from one culture to the next culture, from one generation to the next generation? And I believe, as we talked about last week, and as I think the Apostle Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 5, that Jesus has given us the guidance through the Spirit and the direction that we need to kind of continue to take our Christianity from one generation to the next, from one culture to the next, from one age to the next. And so, So today we're going to jump into part 2, and we're just working through Galatians chapter 5. So I'd encourage you to be reading Galatians chapter 5 during the week. If you want to, you can read all of Galatians to kind of get the gist of the whole book. But I felt like the meat of what he was talking about was in chapter 5, and there's a lot of other really good stuff in Galatians. I'm sorry if your favorite verse is Galatians 2:20. That's a great one, but we don't have time to unpack it all, right? So we're spending 4 weeks here as we think through Galatians chapter 5, and I hope this is helpful to you. And today we're going to look at the next section of verses in Galatians 5, which is verse 7 forward, 7 to 14, I think. Anyway, now, remember, Galatians is a letter that was written 2,000 years ago to a group of Jesus followers who lived in a region called Galatia. Modern day, this area in our modern day world is in Turkey, the country of Turkey. And you can go there today. You can visit these areas. You can visit some of the archaeological ruins of these cities. But this was a region in Galatia, in Turkey, called Galatia. It was a province of the Roman Empire. And Paul had gone through this area on a missionary journey. You can read about in Acts chapter 13. He travels through this area, starts new faith communities there. And then again later, I think in Acts 14 or 14, he circles back through that area, teaching people about Jesus. And after he left, people came in from behind him and kind of amended what he was teaching, changed some of what he was teaching. But this is a letter that he wrote back to these Christians who were mostly young followers of Jesus. And so let's jump in verse 7, where we're going to start for today. So this is what he says in verse 7. He says in Galatians, "You were running the race so well. Who has held you back from following the truth? It certainly isn't God, for he is the one who called you into freedom. This false teaching is like a little yeast that spreads through the whole batch of dough. I'm trusting the Lord to keep you from believing false teachings. God will judge that person, whoever he is, who has been confusing you." So again, some introductory thoughts here to just kind of like set the stage so we kind of understand what's going on, because we are jumping right in the middle of a conversation. These Galatian churches were a really eclectic group of people, right? So many of these people were of their Jewish heritage, because Paul would go to the synagogue, the Jewish synagogue in these cities, and then he would tell them about Jesus. And some people went, "Yay, Jesus," and jumped on the Jesus bandwagon. Other people said, "No, Jesus, we don't like Jesus. We don't like what you're talking about." And so they often would be violent with Paul, kick him out of town, that kind of thing. But then also Paul would tell stories of Jesus and the message of Jesus to people who were non-Jews, the Greeks, the Romans, the locals, those kinds of people who all had different spiritual backgrounds. Some worshipped, most of them would have worshipped the pagan pantheon of gods that Rome offered to them. They might have worshipped the emperor. They might have worshipped Aphrodite or Zeus and all these other gods. They were just a part of the current religious climate of the ancient world. And so you had some of these people following Jesus, and then you had some Jews following Jesus, and you had all these people hanging out together in the same churches, and they had vastly, vastly different cultural backgrounds. Right? So the Jews, you could kind of think of them as just very conservative, lots of rules about everything. We don't eat this, we wear this, we don't go here, we do go here, we talk to these people, not these people. A lot of that. Whereas the pagans, the Gentiles, Romans and Greeks didn't have nearly as many rules to follow. And so this caused a problem. And so one of these questions in the early church was, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? How much of this Jewish stuff comes along with Jesus, and how much do the Greeks and the Romans have to embrace? How Jewish do they need to become in order to become Jesus followers? And so we talked about this last week a bit. Circumcision was the key issue that they said, well, you got to at very least be circumcised. And Paul said, no. Circumcision doesn't mean anything anymore. Its time is over. We don't need to get circumcised in order to make God like us. And he said last week, remember, the only thing that matters is, say it with me, right? Faith working through love. The only thing that matters is faith working itself out in love. So now, in verse 6 here, when we get started, he kind of throws his hands in the air, or verse 7, I think it is. He kind of throws his hands in the air, and he says, you were doing so good. What happened? You forgot about circumcision. You weren't worried about all that. You were enjoying the freedom you had in Jesus, and now something's happened. You went sideways. And so he says, instead of dwelling on the point of who has troubled you, because at one point he asks, this false teaching is like a little yeast, who's done this? He doesn't dwell on this point of who has done this. Instead, what he says is God has called you into spiritual freedom, not into religious bondage. So I want to ask you a question here this morning before we go further as we're thinking about this first part. Have you ever wondered what God's voice sounds like, right? Have you ever wondered what God's voice sounds like? Now you might be, scratching your head a little bit as I ask that question, and I'll tell you, be straight up with you. I don't know what God's voice sounds like. I have never heard God audibly, right? Some people say they have. Awesome. That's awesome for them. I have not. Maybe you have. But on my spiritual journey, there have been times where I can hear a voice that is influencing me, right? It's a voice in my head, or maybe it's in my heart or my soul or in my spirit. And for me, sometimes I can discern and I think, I think that's God's voice encouraging me in a direction. But not all the time, right? Part of our journey of faith is learning how to recognize the voice that we hear within us and how to discern who it is that's talking to us through that voice. Right? Sometimes you think it's the voice of God, but what it actually is, it's the voice of one of your parents. Maybe the one that was more opinionated about things. And they used to tell you, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, right? And now as an adult, you're like, I hear a voice inside my head, but I think it's my dad. I think it's my mom. I'm not sure it's God. Right? For some of us, it might be the voice of a spiritual leader that influenced you significantly when you were young. That's the voice you hear. Sometimes it may be the voice of a brother or a sister who was very influential in your life, who played a big role, came alongside at one point and helped you and served you in a meaningful way. And you continue to kind of hear their voice in your head, and you're kind of, is that my voice? Is that their voice? Is that God's voice? Sometimes it's our own conscience that is talking to us, right? Sometimes the voice you hear within you is your own conscience saying, I don't think you should do this, or I do think you should do this. And sometimes it's the voice of God. Sometimes it's God's Spirit at work in us, moving us. Just like Jesus said, we talked about this last week. Jesus said the Spirit's going to come and guide you into truth, guide you into new truth, new territory. You're going to do greater things than I have as you listen to the Spirit and follow his lead. So there's a way to kind of discern. I know, so you hear all these voices in your head or in your heart or in your soul, and you say, well, how do I know what's what? How do I know who's who? How do I know which one is God? And that's a journey of maturity and growth, of learning to figure that out. But Paul gives us one clue about what God's voice sounds like in this scripture. He tells us, and this is what he says here. You were running the race so well. Who has held you back from following the truth? He says, whose voice are you listening to? Whose voice is holding you back from following the truth? He says, it certainly isn't God. It certainly, that's a lot of confidence right there. It certainly isn't God, for he is the one who called you to freedom. So that's a powerful verse right here. This is amazing, because part of what Paul is telling us here is that God's voice is a voice of freedom. Have you struggled in your own spiritual journey? Should I do this or shouldn't I do this? Or I feel terrible because I feel terrible because I didn't. I feel guilty. I feel shame. And you hear this voice in your head that's pressing that into you. The voice of God is a voice of freedom. Okay, the voice of God is a voice of freedom. Paul was convinced of this. He says, certainly it's not from God if it led you into bondage. Religious bondage. Spiritual bondage. So God's voice is a voice of freedom. And for many of you today, God's voice has always been associated with this message of fix this in your life. Stop that. Do this. Be better. Try harder. Don't do this. Don't go here. Don't go there. And it's this constant voice that brings bondage, brings constriction. And Paul says, I've gotten to know God. I've met Jesus. I'm familiar with the Spirit and his lead in my life. And I'm telling you, the voice of God is a voice of freedom. It's a voice of freedom. And if we're not careful, this is a tricky thing, especially if you live, the longer you're in a faith community, the longer you're religious, if I can use that word, it's tricky because the longer we are, if we're not careful, we'll always associate the voice that's most harsh, the voice that's most strict, the voice that's most conservative, if I can use that word. That voice in our head that's the most strict, harsh, conservative, whatever, it's easy to just say, well, I think that's probably God. That seems more spiritual to us. I don't know if you've experienced it in the same way, but Paul clearly tells us that, and tells these Christians that the truth, who led you away from the truth, he says, into this bondage? Not God. God's voice is a voice of freedom. And truth is on the side of freedom. All right, so that's a game changer. For some of you, that's it. That was the message today. That's all you needed. You're good to go. Hey, we'll see you back next week. All right, but there's more to this message. There's more here in this passage, and we got to keep moving. All right, so Paul goes on, verse 11 here. Let's keep moving forward. Verse 11, dear brothers and sisters, if I were still preaching that you must be circumcised, as some say I do, why am I still being persecuted? If I were no longer preaching salvation through the cross of Christ, no one would be offended. So there's mixed messages going on back in the churches about Paul. After he left, some people came back around and said, hey, Paul thinks you need to be circumcised. Meanwhile, they ran him out of town. And he's saying, hey, you can't have both of these. You can't have both of these realities. And then he says this. He says, I just wish that those troublemakers who want to mutilate you by circumcision would mutilate themselves. All right? This is a good moment where, if the kids are watching on the couch with you, it's awesome. So welcome, family. Depending upon their age, this is maybe a PG-13 Bible verse. All right, so you may, I want to put your hands over the ears of the children as we exposit our Bible teaching today. Because really, at this point in the journey, as Paul's wrestling with this, he's kind of at his wit's end here. He's really frustrated. He's concerned about these Christians. It's been a while since he's been with them. He's frustrated that people have come behind him and are putting them into bondage, taking their freedom. And so he's saying none of this makes sense. And then he says this comment, which is actually one of the harshest things said in the New Testament. Paul gives us Paul has a lot of flowery language that he uses that our Bible translators like to soften and edit because, you got to be able to sell the Bible in Christian bookstores. And if you have an explicit language label on the Bible, Christian bookstores won't sell as many. So anyway, but there should be an explicit language label on the Bible. Anyway, you can think about that. And so this is what Paul says, and again, our translators kind of clean this up, but he's come to believe that these outward expressions of holiness, like circumcision, simply don't make sense anymore, right? We talked about that last week. It doesn't make sense anymore. This is not how we interact with God. This is not the way God works. Because of Jesus, we know better now. Because Jesus came, we know that cutting off a piece of skin from your body does not make you holy. It doesn't make you win favor with God. Because if that were true, Paul is saying, if that were true, then maybe cut the whole thing off, right? That's what he's saying. He's very upset. If you think cutting a piece off makes you holy, just go the whole way, right? Go varsity. Spiritual merit easily becomes associated with all kinds of external behaviors and symbols and rites and religious rituals. It's part of who we are as humans. We like to have that. We want to have measures of status. I remember being in a church one time where I showed up at this church and we were going to use it for something, and the pastor was there, and the pastor was really concerned about the auditorium. And he was very, very clear with me that we cannot have food in the auditorium. We cannot have drinks in the auditorium. And it wasn't because he was concerned about the carpet, right? It wasn't like, well, we don't want to make sure we keep our carpet nice and clean and we don't have to clean up afterwards. It was because that's a holy space. That's where we don't want to defile that space. We don't. This is where we hear from the Lord. This is the house of the Lord. And somehow, taking food or drinks into the auditorium of the church would defile the house of the Lord. And I think Paul would say, hey, if keeping donuts out of the church auditorium is gonna make it holy, right? I can understand if you're like, hey, we don't want to have to clean up those sprinkles on those duck donuts. They just get everywhere, and that's a mess. And we don't want to clean up. But that's not what that's not what he's saying. This is a holy place. And I think Paul would say, if taking donuts into the church auditorium are going to make it holy, then maybe we should remove everything from the auditorium. Then maybe pull up the carpet, pull out the chairs, tear down the stage, take the lights off, because if not letting some things in there keeps it holy, maybe we just need to take everything out of there, so therefore it can be even more holy, right? That's kind of the argumentation that's going on here, and Paul's pushing against this way we think. There are all kinds of ways. These are ways I would call them the new circumcision rules, right? We create new. We're not worried about circumcision today, but we got a whole bunch of other things that we feel like these are our spiritual markers. These are the things that make us legit as followers of Jesus. These are the things that give us some clout. These are the things that might make us a little better than that group of Christians, or make God like us more, this kind of stuff. There's a lot of ways we do this. One of the ways we create a new circumcision is through our doctrinal positions, right? It's not a bad thing for a church to say, hey, this is what we believe, this is where we stand on things. But these become markers. These become, you must believe these 14 things. And then if you do, then you're a real Christian. Then you're approved by God. Well, why 14? Right? Why not make it 24? Right? If 14 makes you holy, 24 would make you really holy. Right? Why stop at 24? Let's make it 124. You need to believe 124 accurate truths about God. Well, how do we know which ones are accurate? Well, they're the ones that we decided are accurate. They're the ones that the theology books I read decided were accurate. And if you believe those things, then you can begin, right? It's a new circumcision. Or baptism. Methods of baptism. Are you familiar with this, right? There's a lot of ways people are baptized. Sometimes as infants, sometimes as grown-ups. As grown-ups, there's a lot of different ways. People get baptized forwards, people get baptized backwards, some go down once, some go down 3 times, some pour, right? There's a lot of ways someone can be baptized. Well, what's the right way? And some would say, unless you do it the right way, you're not really legit. It didn't count, right? I remember my wife and I were, at one point, we were adults. We were in Bible college and we were attending a church, and that church had a specific belief about baptism. Both of us have been baptized before in our lives. And this church had a specific belief about baptism, that you had to be baptized 3 times forward, that was the right way to be baptized. And we were like, well, we think our first, when we got baptized, we think it worked. And we're good. We don't need to get dunked 3 times forward again. But they made it a requirement if you were going to be involved in the church or be a member of the church. And so this becomes a new circumcision. And they're, hey, if that's their conviction, that's their conviction. But what happens, the tricky part on this is that begins to be a framework. It becomes a new circumcision. Whether this is the only way, this is the right way. And if you don't do it this way, well, then you're out. Right? There's a lot of new circumcision rules that we create. Sometimes it might be communion. People have convictions around communion, or maybe it's about your favorite Christian authors. Which authors are the good ones, and you should only read those books. But if you're seen with the wrong author's book on your shelf, right? New circumcision rules. So I hope you're getting the idea here, right? External behaviors, rituals, beliefs, rites. Jesus says, or Paul says, they don't carry weight in the new way with Jesus. On the adventure with Jesus, these things don't matter. And what matters? Remember, we heard it last week. What matters? Faith working itself out through love. All right, so we got to keep moving. Let's move on here. All right, so final section of verses we're going to look at here today. So he says, "For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters, but don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love." Okay, so this is the heart of what Paul has to say in this section of Scripture. You're called to freedom. We're free in Jesus. God's voice is a voice of freedom. Now, he says, don't use that freedom to satisfy, interesting word choice, to satisfy your sinful nature, but rather use it to love one another, right? Use your freedom to serve one another in love. So real quick, I want to give you a little Greek lesson, right? A little Greek. Sarx. This is the Greek word sarx. Here's how you might say it in English. Sarx, right? Sarx is the word that's translated as sinful nature. Now, depending upon what Bible version you're using, when you read the Bible, it often gets translated as the flesh, right? The flesh. Don't use your freedom to satisfy the flesh. So we're going to talk more about this next week, because if you read ahead in the verses, it talks about the spirit and the flesh, the sarx, the sinful nature, a lot in the next week's passage. So we're going to dig more into it. But for now, I simply want you to understand that Paul uses this term sarx a lot when he's talking about that part of us that is the broken part. It's an appetite. See, he uses the word satisfy. Don't satisfy this sinful nature. This sinful nature part of us is this appetite. Now, the Bible starts out with telling us that we are God's amazing creation. We are created in the image of God, that God's creation is good, and people have infinite value and worth because we're created in the image of God, and we can do unbelievable good. We can create, we can love, we can care, we can do unbelievable, amazingly good things, but there's also that part of us that's off. There's something off, right? Paul calls that the sarx, the flesh. It's an appetite to destroy, an appetite for more. It's an appetite, a lust. It's an appetite for, to hurt someone. If someone hurts you, I want to hurt them back. It's that kind of thing. It's that part of us that's just kind of bent wrong. It's that part of us that doesn't lean towards love, right? It's the part of us that leans towards desire or lust. Or it's this insatiable appetite. So that's in us. And Paul says, hey, so I want you to be free, but don't use your freedom as an opportunity to satisfy that part of you, that sarx. Now, I also want to say, and I'll say more about this next week, but the sarx is not the physical body, right? There's a different Greek word for that. It's soma, right? Soma. That's our physical body. Sarx is this more immaterial part of us. So anyway, we'll talk more about that next week, but it's helpful to understand that as we look at these verses today. So Paul says, you are free and God wants you to be free, but don't use that freedom as an opportunity to satisfy your sarx, right? Don't satisfy your flesh with that freedom, but he tells us something else to do. We should use that freedom to serve one another in love. To serve one another in love. The whole law can be summed up, and then he goes on and says this. He says, for the whole law can be summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. But if you are always biting and devouring one another, watch out. Beware of destroying one another. If you're always biting and devouring, see, sarx, appetite. If you're always biting and devouring one another, you're going to destroy one another. And I would say there's a lot of this going on in our country right now, right? A lot of biting and devouring because we're using our freedom in certain ways to satisfy the flesh, this sarx part of us, this sinful nature part of us. But Paul says this whole thing is summed up in this one law. And again, we talk about this often here at Life Church. So if you're getting bored, I'm sorry. It's just right here in the Bible, and we got to talk about it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, if you're gonna love your neighbor as yourself, this is a powerful phrase. This is a powerful, and Paul's saying everything in the Old Testament. He's talking about the Old Testament. Everything in the Old Testament boils down to this thought. It's all about love. Love for neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. But if you're going to love your neighbor as yourself, it means you're going to need to get to know your neighbor, right? You're going to need to know what love looks like for your neighbor. So let's think about it this way. So let's think about a literal neighbor. You live in a little neighborhood and you have a yard and you notice your neighbor's yard, and one day you're like, you know what? I'm going to show love for my neighbor. I'm going to be a really good neighbor, and I'm going to mow my neighbor's lawn. You know, I get home from work early on Friday. You know, I'll get out there and I'll mow his lawn before he gets home from work. And when he gets home, he's just going to be like, oh my goodness, my whole weekend is free now because you mowed my lawn. It's going to be amazing. I'm going to feel good, warm and fuzzy, right? It's going to be like a kumbaya moment. We're going to hold hands and sing with latex gloves on, of course, right? And face masks. So anyway, so you mow your neighbor's lawn, right? And just as you're wrapping up, you're finishing up, you're driving your mower back over to your house and dusting yourself off, your neighbor pulls in and you're just waiting for him to step out and be like, thank you so much. This is amazing. I feel so loved. And they step out and they have a little bit of a contorted look on their face, and you're like, this isn't going how I thought it was going to go. And they're looking at you, and they got a question in their mind, and they say, hey, do you know what happened to my yard? And you're like, oh, I mowed it for you. I just thought I'd help you out. And come to find out, well, he's been looking forward to mow his lawn all day because he loves to mow the lawn. This is something he just loves to. It's therapeutic. It's cathartic. Like there's just something about green grass and straight lines. It's like his favorite part of the weekend. And you took it from him. You're like, well, I was trying to love you. And they're like, that's not the way to love me. You don't know me. You don't know what I love. You don't know what love looks like for me. So, silly story. I know. Bear with me. But here's the deal. To love someone well, we've got to listen to them. We've got to listen to them. We've got to hear them. We've got to know them so that we know how to love them. Because love listens. Love listens. And Paul says, don't use your freedom to satisfy your flesh, but use your freedom to serve one another in love. If you're going to do that, you're going to have to listen. You're going to have to ask questions. You're going to have to find out, what does love look like for this person? Now, you can go 100 miles with this. You can think about this all day. You can think about it in your marriage. You can think about this with your kids. You can think about this with your friends and with your neighbors. How does this apply? But as we wrap up today, because of everything that is going on in our world right now, I want to think about this in a specific context. the single greatest thing that I've done that has kind of transformed my life and my convictions and my opinion about so many cultural issues that divide us was beginning to listen to the experiences of other people who are not like me and to believe them. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I think this is the single greatest thing that has influenced my life in the past 5 to 7 years. To begin to listen to the other side, the stories from people who are not like me, to hear them and listen to them and believe them, and then to begin to pull that into my processing. So several years ago, when the Black Lives Matter movement began, I felt really uncomfortable with it. As far as I knew, I wasn't a racist. I didn't hold to that ideology. I didn't behave in that way. And I've enjoyed interacting with people from all walks of life and from differing racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. But as is fairly obvious this morning, I'm a white guy. And I grew up in a very white world. So I was becoming more and more aware that I was completely ignorant of the Black experience in America. To me, at that time, the Black Lives Matter movement felt like a poor response to some unfortunate and isolated experiences. But then it happened again, and it happened again. And I was encouraged to listen. I knew what the world looked like from my perspective. I already understood that, right? I already understood my own perspective. What I didn't know was someone else's perspective. And if I was going to work my faith out in love in this context, I needed to learn what love looked like by listening. And so I began a several-year journey, which I am very much still on, of learning about the Black experience in the United States of America. And so I learned about slavery and how Christian theologians and pastors and parishioners defended it tooth and nail, right up until the last gun was fired in the Civil War. And even after that, even in the North, there was still... I learned about the failure of Reconstruction and how after 400 years of back-breaking labor, and the enslaved people were set free, but they weren't given a penny to their name. I learned how the United States government promised the enslaved people that once they were freed, they would be granted 40 acres and a mule to help them get started in their new life so they wouldn't be penniless. But eventually, the government changed their mind about that, and all the land that they had given to the newly freed people was taken back from them and given back to the plantation owners. I learned about vagrancy laws and how Black men who had just been freed from slavery but couldn't find work now could be thrown in jail and charged with a crime of not having a job. And because of a loophole in the 13th Amendment, where it says that slavery would be abolished in our land except as a punishment for a crime, this loophole would be exploited. So these freed slaves, wrongly charged with the crime of not having a job, would now be legally arrested and re-enslaved because they were criminals now. I learned about lynching and how, statistically speaking, beginning at the end of the Civil War and for 100 years, right up until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, almost every week for 100 years, a Black person was lynched in this country. 4,000 lynchings in 100 years. I cannot even imagine the psychological trauma inflicted by the experience and the threat of lynching upon a population. I learned about the Great Migration that happened as Black people tried to escape the suffocating injustices of the South, as new factories were opening and jobs were available in new cities all across the country. And they fled out of the south to the north to the west, looking for a new hope and new life. They fled to Philadelphia, to Baltimore, to Detroit, to Oakland, to Minneapolis, to Chicago. The African American populations in these cities surged during this great migration. But once arriving in these northern cities, they were met with more racism. They faced intense discrimination and were told that they were going to steal the white man's jobs. So then I learned about redlining and how black people were prevented from getting the mortgages that they needed to buy homes. And then were systematically restricted from the post-World War II housing boom that most of the middle class took advantage of in the 1950s. As suburbs became the new rage, Levittown, New Jersey, Levittown, Pennsylvania were new models of neighborhoods. And they had written into their neighborhood contracts that these were neighborhoods for white people. And a realtor could lose their license for selling a house to a black person, a house that is in a white neighborhood. I learned about Martin Luther King and his message and his efforts, and how Christians, white Christians in his day, were silent as he fought for justice. I learned about the war on drugs, history that now I can remember. I remember the messaging of the war on drugs. But I learned that this war on drugs has been proven to disproportionately affect black and brown people for political motivations. I learned how the criminal justice system has been bent towards injustice towards black and brown people for 100 years. I've learned that if you have been convicted of a crime, it's statistically proven that you will get a harsher sentence if you're a black man than if you're a white man. I learned that 1 in 3 black men will at some point in their life spend time in prison. And that for white men, it's 1 in 17. And it's not because black men commit more crimes than white men. I learned that while black men only make up 6% of the population of the United States of America, they represent 40% of the prison population. And then I started to talk to the black people I knew who might be willing to share some of their own personal experiences with me. And I began to understand what is meant by white privilege and how I have benefited from it. I began to listen and believe. I believed the stories. And it changed me. And Paul says, don't use your freedom to satisfy the appetite of the flesh, but serve one another in love. And love listens. And right now our country is on fire. And we've got to learn as followers of Jesus to work our faith out in love. There's a lot of pain because of our historic unwillingness as a culture to listen and believe the black experience. I don't have the answers. But I'm listening. And I know that many of you Life Churchers are too. You're listening with me. And for our black and brown brothers and sisters who have suffered, who have been called names, who have been looked at sideways, who have people walk to the other side of the street as you were walking down the street, this and 1,000 other ways in which you have felt the sting of prejudice and racism. I'm so sorry that we live in a culture and participate in a culture that has devalued you in such drastic ways. I know that Jesus is with you, and it feels trite to say that on my end of the equation, because I know that Jesus is always he sides with the oppressed. He told us that, Luke chapter 4. I'm seeking out good news for the poor and the oppressed, prisoners set free. That's the message of Jesus. He stands with you. I hope that you can feel that and experience that. But we need you to teach us what you know, those of us who are willing to listen. But so I want you to know you are welcome at this table here at Life Church. Not just welcome at this table, but we need you at this table as we have these conversations and try to figure out, where do we go? What is our part to play in this? So if you'll help us, we will endeavor to make this a safe church, and that we will endeavor to be a part of the answer and not a part of the problem. And we won't get it right all the time, but we will listen and believe and learn, so we can learn how to love one another, how to serve one another in love. So we are adventure. This is the adventure of Jesus. This is what he calls us into. Let his Spirit guide us into this. Let his Spirit lead us into this. And by his Spirit, we'll follow where he leads. We are free. Don't be slaves again to the bondage. And don't use our freedom to satisfy the sarx, the flesh. But let's use our freedom to serve one another in love. Let me pray for us. Jesus, thank you so much for these moments here this morning. There's a lot to say here, a lot to think about. And this is going out on the internet, and I don't even know how all this gets heard out there. I don't know how this impacts people. I just pray that you would help us listen, help us love, help us use our freedom to love. Help us come together as a church, as followers of you. Help us see through all the noise that's out there. And may we be a people who bring healing, help, and hope. Thank you for these moments, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.